And I like the idea of trying to get the number as close to living for an individual as we feel like the Olympia labor market can tolerate. It's probably $24 an hour for one person.
So the intent of tonight's conversation is to look at how we are defining kind of a scope and timeline and process for looking at minimum wage. I've prepared a handout for the discussion tonight to support the discussion tonight. So just to highlight what's there is a project purpose, a scope, and a schedule. In terms of what's on the back, I wanted to highlight some of the background, and I'll just slightly cover some of the background about how we got to this point. So I think some of you are familiar, but for anyone who's listening, our own council member Jim Cooper kind of brought forward this conversation back in 2015 and put forward a policy framework at that time. So I'll also note that, shortly after the COVID-19 pandemic, we did some work around economic response and recovery as a region. And at that time really started to understand through the pandemic kind of where the inequities and really where the system challenges were in terms of, economic stability for our community members. And kind of again brought this issue of livable wage to the forefront. Following on the heels of that, Mike Reed took the lead in developing Olympia Strong, which is a set of strategies to address economic challenges and resiliency for our community members. So a set of strategies tailored specifically to us. And within that work, identified that we have community members that are struggling with housing instability, increased cost of living, limited mobility, affordable workforce housing, and just systemic inequality discrimination, and really a desire for higher wage jobs. So that's not everything that was identified in Olympia Strong, but certainly the ones that might tie to the topic that we're talking about tonight. So, and then lastly, you've received some comments from some of our local labor union and representatives asking for you to take into consideration a workers' bill of rights, and included within that would be an increase in minimum wage. So what I understand from you at this point, and this is really up for discussion tonight, is that the priority is to look at addressing minimum wage in between now and the end of the year. And then maybe perhaps in the first quarter of next year is to maybe take up further conversation around other items that are in the proposed workers' bill of rights. So that's by way of introduction. We can go ahead and work through kind of the proposed scope and schedule, and then open it up for conversation if that sounds good to you. Okay. Okay. So I'll go ahead and touch on what you see in front of you, and then we can open it up for feedback, input, and conversation. So in terms of what's the purpose of this work? As I said, it's really consideration of an ordinance to increase the current minimum wage. The scope would look at the focus on minimum wage at this point. It'd be understanding the potential legal requirements or implications around an increase to minimum wage. It'd be looking at what other cities that have taken similar actions have done, including the wage that was set, their implementation, the process they underwent, outreach and engagement, and if we know what maybe some of the outcomes have been. We would also look at doing some targeted outreach and what I'll call informational engagement with some community groups to say this is what the proposal is, and gathering some input on that and talking about the process. And then lastly, that would lead into essentially a study session with council to talk about kind of what the impacts would be of an increase, and exploration around any kind of potential options for what that increase would be and what implementation could look like. So that's essentially a proposed scope. In terms of timeline, we're here tonight to talk about this piece. Over the next couple months, again, this is a very concentrated timeline. So I think just so we're all aware, it was a very fast moving proposal. But we would be doing some of that research and analysis piece to be able to put something in front of you all as a full council to consider. We would need to we'd move to an executive session, and then next on to a study session to really have the full conversation with council around what the options and impacts and proposed steps forward would be. I'll note here some of the kind of specific groups in which to engage from, I've gathered from some of you up to date. It's potentially not an all-inclusive list, but does take into account that this is a shortened time frame. And so just being kind of, cognizant of that. And then I've heard interest in holding a public hearing or have an opportunity to maybe gather some additional public comment on the proposal, of course, and then moving into the process of ordinance adoption. So that's in a nutshell, kind of a response to input that I've heard thus far, and I would just open it up for conversation.
Thank you, Stacy and Jay, for bringing, he's not here anymore, but I'm going to say that, for bringing forward this idea. I think all of us have been kind of tracking what's going on in the workplace since COVID, and it's very different than it was in a lot of places before the pandemic. It's hard to get good people, and it's hard to keep them there if you don't have good practices that are friendly to taking care of your family and all of those other things that need to happen while you're at work. And we're hearing that from our workers. We have some here today. I think all three of us were at the kickoff workers summit for this conversation in downtown Olympia. And we were hearing some pretty hard stories to hear about scheduling, about, wage, about not getting enough hours or getting mandatory overtime, safety because you're working mandatory overtime. And I think I'm the reason that I believe that this says go now with minimum wage and take a minute to look at the other workers' Bill of Rights items. In 2015, when I proposed predictive scheduling, minimum wage, and sick and safe leave, we were talking about all of those things at a statewide level. It was really awesome for Olympia to be part of that Comp 15 Now conversation at that time. At that time, we determined that we just didn't have the capacity to do the predictive scheduling, largely because we don't have the budget size to start a Department of Labor like Seattle does and do enforcement in that space. I think where we are now, it makes a lot of sense to open those conversations back up and see how they fit into the new environment, see what we do have the capacity and ability to do, maybe from a civil infraction standpoint. Things are between an employer and their employee. And then if there's things that we don't feel are in our bailiwick or that we might be able to do, but might be too high risk legally, which we run into kind of often. We don't always want to be first on new things, then we want to look at our legislative agenda and be looking at what can we talk to the legislature about. And, I do think that the answer continues to be statewide policy around worker rights and safety and wage. But I also know that like Seattle and Tukwila and SeaTac and a few other cities, it just costs more than the state minimum wage. And to Clark's point in the previous conversation, how can we help people keep from feeling like they need to live somewhere else when they work downtown or work at the mall or work at the auto mall or anywhere in our community, at our grocery stores. And so I think it makes sense if we can. Like, I'd love to see us move on minimum wage aggressively, like you've laid out, if we can actually pull that off. And I also was the one that suggested a public hearing because I feel like there's always going to be public process that we all want to see in this kind of a conversation. And, just putting ourselves out there for one evening like that will make sure that anyone who at least knows that that's happening would have a chance to have their voice heard in the process before we move to any kind of final actions. So I'm excited about this. I think that we should roll with a $20 minimum wage and see how far we get, and love to hear what my colleagues think about that. And I think the last thing I'll say is I think that first quarter of next year, let's look right away in the beginning of the year at where do we think the pieces of the Bill of Rights that are in our power are, and so we can build that into the finance work plan for next year. Kind of leave that as our legacy as a committee so that it's scheduled in next year's work plan to make sure that we do that work. make sure that we stay alongside, gosh, I think like 30,000 or 25 to 30,000 workers in our city.
So my first question is about the amount. That $20 is a number to consider. I'm also thinking if we're doing research, there's the other numbers from the Alice report, from MIT, from the UW about what does it take if rent is where it's at and the food basket and health expenses are where they're at, you know. So there's the question of should the minimum wage be a livable wage, right? So I hope that might be considered in this conversation. And we also had discussed, rather than choosing a round number, that it might be a number with an inflator automatically built into it so that it doesn't quickly get eclipsed. And then my one little pushback in this plan is that we've explicitly named business groups and sort of generally named people who would be advocating for working class people and poor people. And we've got a Chamber of Commerce consultant to do the research. So it feels to me pretty loaded towards asking if employers would like to pay more. And I don't know if that's a helpful frame that we want to know, you know, broadly the costs and benefits or the impacts that having low wage workers have a more secure wage might provide to the community. But I don't know that reaching out to the business community that they have a sense of what that impact might be on the stability of the local economy. So I would suggest that we look to other sorts of experts about what's the social benefit of having people make more money in town. So that's on my mind. The schedule, I would love to have us work this schedule. I think it'd be terrific. And while I personally think that the Bill of Rights protections are at least as significant as the wage on the check, I also know that it's been years in coming trying to get a minimum wage increase. So I'm glad to focus on that first. And I really do hold out a lot of my hopes and a lot of my energy will be around those Bill of Rights issues, because I think that's what actually has life-changing sorts of impacts for folks. You know, I'm super glad we're moving forward. Yeah.
So may I ask for some clarification?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So thank you for that. I appreciate the conversation around the engagement piece in particular. So I'm going to ask a clarifying question. In terms of including Jason Robertson, that's mostly that was tied to the expedited process, because there's some ease in using someone who's familiar with Olympia Strong and kind of understands our direction. So are you are you providing input to maybe work with someone different or do the research in a different way?
Both. I think that there are economists who are looking at the broader implications and not necessarily the cost or the advantage to small businesses.
Yeah.
And so I hope that we can bring in some economic consulting that looks at sort of the whole ecosystem of all of the people and all of the money, right? And I'm not opposed to having the employer community consider the impacts and offer us input, but I wouldn't lead with having them decide what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms nonprofit organizations could be read a couple of different ways. As employers of low wage people, or as advocates for low-wage people. And I'm not sure what that bullet represents on there. Were they another employer group like ODA, or were you thinking like CALO and folks like that who might weigh in about advocating for low-wage workers?
I think the context of the conversations that I've had with some of you to date have been around nonprofits as employers, as impact employers.
Yes.
But I understand also the perspective of considering, the advocates. So I think what I'm cautious of is that if we want to expand the scope of our engagement, I think we need to take a hard look at the resourcing and timeline. That's where my hesitancy comes in. Is I agree with you. The benefit of the different perspectives is huge, and I just want to temper that with the balancing how you might want to move forward in terms of timing.
I appreciate that, and I'll just close with in terms of this balance, because I know it's controversial issue, and that finding a middle ground that we can make happen is going to take some work. But I also think in terms of the question of can we afford to have a wage an hour person on the city, that somehow we have afforded to have an economic development staff, to have executive staff attending business community meetings on a regular basis, having city staff participate in a business community-led regional legislative agenda. And all of those have been things we've found a way to afford. So I just think that this sort of advocacy is also something we can find a way to afford.
And then, thank you. I like what you're saying, because when I look at this whole thing, I would love to see this minimum wage go quickly. It's not really a discussion point. I did spend a lot of time today looking on all the different calculators out there. And by the way, one in our own state, you might want to look at University of Washington self-sufficiency standards, which they're trying to advocate to move away from HUD to them. And there's a lot of rationale because they use in their calculator, like the MIT does, considerations of costs of just living. And it's not just about rent. And then I just got an article that said all medical care or healthcare in the state of Washington is going up 10% in 2025, which is just another bill to people who can't afford it, especially if your business takes it out of your salary or part of it. So I like where you're going, Clark, in terms of community engagement. I want to make sure it's a balanced approach as best we can in this short timeline. Believe me, I recognize that. So maybe when we're talking about our balanced voice, which is not the business owners, that we reach out to set labor groups and say, who's your expert? Who can we talk to that give us input? That would be my recommendation, so that we have that voice. And as far as nonprofits go, when we talked about it, gosh, was it 2018? The nonprofits came out in droves and told us that it was going to make them go under. But I also happen to know some of those nonprofits, the people are making a career out of it. So we need to take care of them as much as those that are nonprofits advocating for the work we're going to try to undertake. So I think it's both. And as far as the Bill of Rights goes, I absolutely 100% agree with you, Jim. This should be parked into finance, and it should be one of the major work items next year besides our budget conversations that we're going to have. I think those are the two, because it's a common practice even in my profession to give people 2 hours shy of full time so they don't get benefits. And that doesn't help them, or they change around their schedule. And I like the 10-hour because I've had staff tell me that they've worked in places where they work till midnight and were expected to be there at 6 a.m. So I think this is about time, is my opinion. And you're right, it's going to be somewhat of a discussion between what are we capable of doing and what does the state have to do for us. And then lastly, I'm a broken record and I will stay that way as long as I'm here. When we get B&O revenue streams, which are not even part of the picture that we heard about tonight, some of this money should be going to funding some of this work. It's as a business owner, when I was paying B&O, and I've talked to other business owners about this, and they're all like, I wouldn't have a problem paying for that if I knew it was going back into our community. So I think we should be earmarking a good part of what we're doing to the Oli Strong and some of this work so that there's a known revenue stream that's not going to stress our budget right off the bat. So I like the timeline for the ordinance. We have 4 other people we have to work with to get there. So the study session, I think, will be very informative of where everybody is sitting. I do like the calculator for CPI, just like the state minimum wage does, because at one time, federal minimum wage of $7.50 was actually big, but then we left it behind. So a calculator is a good thing. And then seeing if we can get enough engagement to make sure, and an imbalanced engagement, and then put this on to finance next year. And legislative agenda, Susan and Nick.
Yeah, in my day job, I work with a bunch of organizations nationally, and it's surprising to me how many states are still $7.25. Like it's just, it's criminal. Like no one can live off that anywhere in the United States. It's really hard. I love everything you all said. So I think we're in a good place. CPI is how I would, index to the state CPI. So we don't have to create our own indicator. And so when the state goes up, ours goes up from whatever. And I like the idea of trying to get the number as close to living for an individual as we feel like the Olympia labor market can tolerate. It's probably $24 an hour for one person to survive here. But the new Seattle minimum wage is going to be like a little less than 20 and a quarter, I think, or around 20 and a quarter. And I just don't know, like, if that's something that our community would support or not. So I like the idea of getting the number right, not just picking around one. The Bill of Rights, and the reason I think that, and I think you kind of implied this, Clark, but I want to say it out loud, is the reason we thought about separating them is because that the workplace safety and scheduling work is just more complex, and the minimum wage is a tried and true ordinance at this point that we know will hold up in court, and so we can do that as a city action separately while we make sure we get the rest of it right. And part of that, as you have mentioned at some point in the last couple of weeks, is we need to make sure that we're not just doing what grocery workers need, right? And so the Labor Council has chimed in, and we want to make sure we hear from the longshore and the medical workers, and we know that all of those industries have changed dramatically, and we want to make sure that we give enough time to make sure that we're not missing something significant in that side of the work, in my opinion. Experts. So back in 2015-16, the University of Washington had a researcher doing minimum wage research on the city of Seattle's dime. And so it probably, with some Googles, you might be able to find the outcomes of those research. And then also the University of Washington Tacoma has this awesome guy. His name is Dr. Ali Modares, Modares, and he's an economist, and he helps in the research on the United for Alice project that happens in my day job. But he's an economist well beyond that, so I don't want to bring my day work as a reason. It's his expertise. And then I really appreciate what Clark said about the list, and I think we should collapse it. I think it should say labor organizations, nonprofit organizations, and business organizations. And then who we hear from can be deliberate, but within categories and not within named entities. And that way, if we don't get to one, we don't get to one. And if we talk to one that's not on there, that's good too.
Okay, So I think what I'm hearing is move forward with the proposed timeline and the elements of the approach. I think a more intentional and strategic outreach and conversations balanced amongst labor, and business and nonprofit. And then lastly, I really appreciate the recommendations for where to get more information and the references for the economists so we can again have a balanced approach in our research and data that we could share as well.
Cool.
Am I missing anything?
When you're speaking to the groups, I know I've heard Jim say this, a phased-in approach for certain size businesses. It would be lovely to get an input on what they're thinking those size businesses would be. Off the top of my head, I would think, 25, Jim said 50, but it would be interesting to see if you get a moment of honesty where they're looking and going, hey, I'm going to be part of this. I'm going to be a team member in this. What are they thinking? Just like we should look at our B&O taxes, below a certain gross, we shouldn't be charging. Right.
I think a few of the cities that have done minimum wage have some threshold like that. So whether it's an exemption or a phase in, so I think it's worth knowing all of that research. I personally don't really support an exemption, but small businesses may be able to do a different phase in over a couple of years.
And if they, having owned a business for 15 years, you can plan it in. But I think that kind of information probably for the study session too, if we just have some ideas to throw to the council, because the rest of that work will be done in October to November. Because I think that will be something that's concerning to some of our council mates is the small businesses. And then one last question. We have businesses that cross out of the city of Olympia. I wouldn't necessarily call them huge corporations, but maybe local businesses that are in multiple cities and the impact on that. I think a positive for all their employees, but that's just my opinion.
If I may. So with other cities who've got their own minimum wage, it only applies to people who work hours within that jurisdiction.
Okay.
So a company can have espresso stands across 3 counties, but only their employees inside working hours inside Olympia would be taxed at that rate. And so it's not uncommon for a small business to have a whole set of different payroll tax rates for different employees in different work locations. So I think we can manage that.
Ready
Yeah.
answer. There you
Yeah.
go. That's the answer. And I'm, yeah, please.
Just so that it's on the record, I think there's also places where there's exemptions and phase-ins that are based on company size. And if you said 25, like you said, that would be anywhere in the world. So one McDonald's is not exempt because they have a 16-person crew, right? Okay.
Right. Believe me, I'm all for this. You can be a business and you can be ethical and you can treat your people well. And that's how you keep your employees. So I have a very strong opinion that minimum wage needs to go up. And the Bill of Rights needs to go forward.
Okay, thank you for the direction.
Hope you liked this video. Thanks for watching.